All right. Well, I'd like to have a little bit more formal introduction of Carlos, and then I want to say something about the Quaker world in the context in which Carlos's chapters uh, can be found, and then I'm going to hand it over to Carlos to take it away. So, Carlos Figueroa holds a dual PhD in political science and historical studies from the New School for Social Research. He's an associate professor of politics at Ithaca College in the United States, who researches and writes on race, religion, and class politics, interpretive policy analysis, the politics of Quakerism, U.S. Puerto Rico affairs, the Quakerism of Bayard Rustin, and his work has appeared in the Journal of Public Affairs Education, Journal of Race and Policy, Political Science Quarterly, Annals Ethics in Economic Life, Fair Observer, Common Dreams, the University of Virginia Press, Kansas University Press, and Rutledge Press. So, Carlos, very glad to have you here today to talk to us about Bayard Rustin's life. Carlos and I met in England, actually, at
At
Woodbrook,
Woodbrook.
for a Friends Association for Higher Education, 2019, I think, the spring of
Right.
2019. And we hit it off, and one of the connections we had was both having interest in Rustin, and I was excited to hear that Carlos was doing some research on him. So when Rhiannon Grant and I, my co-editor for the Quaker World, when we started laying out chapters and requests to thank you, we started talking about who we wanted to have involved, and I knew that I wanted to get Carlos involved in the project. One of the things I want to say about the Quaker World that is pertinent for our discussion today, we really wanted to, one, emphasize global Quakerism, and we wanted to emphasize Quakerism as a diverse movement of people. And certainly Bayard Rustin fits into this. Really want to poke a hole in the old stodgy white Quaker guy with a beard, looks, maybe a little older than me, hopefully, but something like me. Really wanted to poke a hole in that and say, Quakers come in all shapes, sizes, races, backgrounds, etc. And another piece, and an important piece, was to interspersed among the different chapters of Quaker history and Quaker ethics, we wanted to have biographies of actual Quakers. It felt important to us to be able to integrate kind of the theory with the way that Quakers have tried to live out our commitments over time. And so, biography, there's multiple biographies throughout the book. And we, of course, have our main topic, Bayard Rustin, today, but other Quakers from around the world and with different perspectives on things. So those were two pieces that were really important to us. And so that brings us up to Carlos has two chapters. He's going to tell us about the chapters. One focuses on Rustin as a Quaker and person of faith. So much of the work that's done on Rustin is about how he was an activist, how he was, a political thinker. In very rarely does it ever explore his faith. So his spirituality is one of the focuses. And we have a second chapter that gets into Rustin's politics and his activism and other pieces. So you get two. Rustin is the only person in the entire 600-page Quaker World who gets two chapters. So how cool is that? Carlos, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm under the weather, so if you see me reaching out for this can, it's a little bubbly water, grape, blueberry, tangerine. Well, thank you for inviting me again, and it's been an interesting journey since that 2019 meeting. And even before that, I came across Bayard Rustin's work through my broader Quaker history work. First, let me preface that I am not a Quaker. I do have Quaker sensibilities, and I've been embraced by the Quaker world because of my work. So I have I've attended meetings in the UK down the street, and out in the US here in Ithaca. So basically, I've I feel the sense of unity among the Quaker world. So Rustin, of course, is one that I came across, as I said, through my work on Quaker history, in particular political Quaker history, and also my work on African American history and politics. So I do that as well. So he fits right in multiple ways. Uh, so as Wes alluded to, I have two different chapters that were not intended to be two different chapters. I was a little ambitious as I started with the Rustin work. I ended up giving them, I don't remember how many pages and how many words, but it was a very large document. And I believe it was maybe something like 70 pages of work. And they said, oh, that's a little too big for a chapter. So then Rhiannon and Wes decided, they posed a question. Is it possible that I can try to produce two chapters out of this work? And the ambitious side of me said, oh, yes, I can do that very easily. And if you know how research and writing goes, it is not as easy as it is. You never want to let go of phrases and sentences and any of that. But I found a way of doing it, and I will share that process with you now in a few seconds. The other thing is that I have a few slides that I want to use to present, but I want to make it more, I guess the word is iterative, like back and forth. I will go the slide, but then I also look at the text. I like to read from Rustin's words because that's the kind of approach that I've taken in these two chapters. So a long way of saying that I engaged a historical actor such as Rustin based on, again, his or their kinds of experiences. So I try to avoid the what others have done in the past is try to tie themselves or apply a theory from the present and try to make sense of the past. So let me just share a few slides and get into that. Let's see if I can figure this out. I think I just lost you. Oh, I need co-host capabilities so I can share my slide.
Let's see if that works.
Okay. Yes.
Great.
Let's see if I can get this to
There will be
open.
opportunity for questions and discussion after Carlos shares.
Oh, oh. Can you see me? Can you see it?
Right now, we're seeing
The slide?
the app itself, not just the slide, but the whole PowerPoint application.
Oh, oh wow. Now I have something. Oh, I'm having issues here. Let me see if I can figure this out. Sorry. Ooh, I think I have multiple windows open with different slides.
Hmm.
But I don't understand what happened. Oh,
And you might
okay.
need to hit presentation and then share the page that is in presentation mode.
Maybe that's what it is because I have my other monitor here showing me the slide, but down here it's showing me the participants' faces, and I can't
Okay.
figure out what is happening. Let's see. Um,
And if you want to email it to me, I could try to, if that would be easier. There you go. Yep, you got it.
presentate. Why is it? Oh, okay. I have a different window. Let's see. So can you see the slide?
Yeah, looks great.
I'll just do this because that's fine. Thank you. So this is Rustin at a very young age. As you can see the photo there, and that's one of my favorite photos because he's just relaxed, right? Happy. The you can see everything that surrounds him, right? It's just good-natured individual. So some of the key questions that basically guided the two chapters, as I said, it was originally a bigger piece of work, and I had to find a way of dividing it. So here's some of the questions that I posed to try to guide the research and also connect it to what Wes basically said earlier that not many, if not no one, has really focused on Rustin's religious or faith to try to make sense of it and try to make connections with his faith and his social and political activism. So that's one of my starting points, trying to figure out what is it and then how does that inform his politics. So in what ways, if at all, did faith or religion, especially Quakerism, shape Rustin's political thought and social activism? What kind of Quaker was Rustin, and what form did his Quakerism take? In what ways did his political thought and social actions align with his Quaker values? To what extent was Rustin's Quakerism consistent throughout his social and political life? Because he, as many of you know, he had almost 50 years of active life. So that's a lot of time. Again, as human beings, we fluctuate, we change our views, we grapple with issues from our own perspectives and interpretations. So this is part of what I am trying to bring here. So here I wanted to put it in a slide in terms of the kind of approach I take to biography. When I was asked to focus on a biography in this way, I thought about it. So here I focus on three aspects of it: so the historical, the contextual, and the interpretive parts of biography. And my starting point is premised on historian Quentin Skinner, who's also from I believe he's from England. In his book Visions of Politics, basically captured the essence of this approach that I take. So he says we need to make it one of our principal tasks to situate the text we study within such intellectual contexts as enable us to make sense of what their authors were doing in writing them. My aspiration is not, of course, to enter the thought processes of long dead thinkers. It is simply to use the ordinary techniques of historical inquiry to grasp their concepts, to follow their distinctions, to appreciate their beliefs, and so far as possible to see things their way. So here again, it's not applying a theoretical framework or lens or looking at people in the past, in particular Rustin, from the eyes of the present, of our own right experiences, which of course would be unfair to do so. So I say here that I attend to Rustin's own terms within his ever evolving cultural, social, political, and economic contexts, the concepts and languages that were available to Rustin and his contemporaries. So again, if a particular concept is no longer in use, but it was in use at the time, that's what I focus on. the questions that Rustin and his contemporaries engaged with or attempted to answer within their own historical time and political, economic, and cultural understandings. So again, this is what I try to do to bring out Rustin's work and try to answer these questions overall. So a little bit of the background. So here's a shorthand, and I will be drawing on a little bit from chapter 39. So this is from the book. Chapter 39 provides the broader picture of Rustin's Quakerism and his family background. So if you were to read these hand in hand, I would read 39 first and then 22 second, even though they're listed in separate ways for different reasons in the text. So 39, I draw on his biography here. So born, of course, in Westchester, PA in March 1912. He died in 1987 in New York City at the age of 75. He raised in the 1920s, 1930s within an integrated northeastern Quaker town, basically Westchester, Pennsylvania. Graduated valedictorian from Westchester, Pennsylvania High School in 1932. He adopted a more gradualist, integrationist approach to politics and policy reform, rooted in what I call his pragmatic Quaker faith. And I'll share that in a hopefully interesting slide that I've included here. So I wanted just to read a little bit from the text itself on what he calls the chronicles of my history, so you can get a picture of what he was trying to deal with at the time. So again, this is the kind of the approach that I'm taking here. So we know that he was raised by his grandparents, his grandfather and his grandmother, grandfather Jennifer and grandmother Julia, both attended the African Methodist Church in Westchester. They were both involved in the NAACP as well. While his grandfather, Jennifer, was also an active member of the church, of the AME Church, Rustin's early political thinking was essentially shaped by his grandmother's broad Christian outlook and values and her social activism. She taught him the importance of ecumenical collaborative work. These early lessons gave Rustin the confidence to partake in future anti-war protest and nonviolent direct action for social justice and economic rights, basically from the 1940s to the 1980s, early 1980s. So here is from the book that he published in 1976, where he directly tells us what Westchester basically meant to him as a source of his, again, not only his upbringing, but also his religious beliefs and eventual political activism. So while Westchester was certainly no utopia of interracial harmony, he says, indeed, segregation and discrimination were two of the first words that had significant meaning for me. However, the extent of racism was not so deep as to prevent a Black youngster from becoming aware of his cultural and historical heritage. End quote. So here, part of what I interpreted based on this statement, that he appeared to understand the concept of race not in biological terms, but rather as a social category of cultural and other kinds of difference. For Rustin, racism seemed to mean living under a political and economic structure and related policies based on a notion of alleged white superiority that determined not only the civic worth, but also the kinds of treatments Blacks in Westchester experienced. He claims that despite such an often limiting environment, Blacks in Westchester were still cognizant of their heritage and were able to draw on it in their lives. Rustin captured the complexity of living in an integrated northeastern Quaker town while surrounded by a larger Jim Crow segregated environment in the 1920s and 30s. And if you allow me, I want to read the second part of this statement that he gives because it's very rich, and you'll see why. So he continues, Westchester was not the Deep South, he says, with its rigid, enforced Jim Crow and its shambles of an educational system, nor was it the archetypical Northern ghetto with its malignant pattern of social dislocation. The high school I attended was integrated, and while, because of my Blackness, I was deprived of honors I had earned, my intellectual and athletic achievements were recognized. Moreover, Westchester's Black community was economically and socially heterogeneous. It included occasional representatives of the Black bourgeoisie, mainly businessmen and property owners, working class Blacks, some of whom were struggling to break the bonds of impoverishment, and others who had given up the struggle, the down and outers. And then he says, from these diverse people, so he's looking at the diverse Black community of Westchester and their diverse experiences, I learned about my own heritage. They sang me Negro ballads, quoted me Negro poetry, and recited folk tales told by slaves. I met Black ministers, Black political leaders, and Black visionaries. And through all these encounters, I gained an understanding of the Negro struggle. This happened simply because these indigenous forms are about precisely that, he says. They tell of the struggles of Blacks, first against slavery and then against discrimination. They are, in short, chronicles of my history, end quote. So here, Rustin basically recognized the political and economic conditions shaping his Blackness as another expression of white racial prejudice in the United States, while equally acknowledging the heterogeneity found within the Black community in Westchester. So accordingly, it seems that within this environment, Blacks were free to cultivate a distinctive culture, drawing on past but also present American struggles against social and political discrimination and economic domination. So hence, Rustin saw his cultural heritage not from an African diasporic perspective, but rather within an American context where Black struggles for political and civic freedom and social and economic equality were indigenous forms. So again, this is looking at the way he considered Westchester from, again, his own experiences, allows us to see uh, how he navigated, right, between these struggles, but also how he reveals the diversity within the Black community. Right, this is something that many historians and others do not point to. We end up lumping or collapsing, right, the Black community as one notion. Right here, he's laying out the humanity, right, the differences from the wealthy to the working class within the Black community. So this is my attempt. Again, technology, I could not figure out how to put in these bubbles or use this right, the Venn diagrams, if you will. So I ended up handwriting it. So I took a picture of my board, and I think this is, hopefully you can see this. Let me know if you can't make out the words. So here, my attempt is to try to capture Rustin's very ecumenical religious faith, what I'm calling pragmatic Quakerism. So here, as you can see, I have various elements that he's drawing from. So the two circles in the middle, the Venn diagram, combine what he, again, brings out in his own writing. The spiritual authority, the will of God, means a lot to him, which is something that he drew from his own grandmother, where the will of God, the inner light notion that he drew from her, who was not a Quaker, by the way. She attended meeting, uh, and she was active within the Quaker community, but she was not a Quaker in the way that um, others have described her. But he drew on her faith. On the other side, of course, she also provided scriptural um, statements for him while he was in prison, and I can provide that as well. So here you see the scriptural authority side of Rustin, which I'm trying to bring together, that aligns itself with the Christian New Testament side and also the Judeo Old Testament side that he brings out in his writings. Of course, the third part of it is the at the bottom where he draws on the Gandhian philosophy, the Eastern side. And the four pillars of Gandhian's philosophy, as you can see, truth, nonviolence on one side, and on the other side, the what's called the Sarvodaya, or the universal uplift, progress for all concept, and the Satyagraha, passive political resistance. So you can already start seeing where he's drawing the nonviolence approach, the direct action approach that he eventually um, brings to the civil rights movement a little more. So I have um, this aspect, and I just wanted to just show some examples of this from Rustin in his in the text. Basically, let's see if I can get this out here. This is one example from, and this is in chapter 22 of the text. I will be going back and forth as I can. This is part of what his grandmother taught him to discuss an issue only when calm. So Rustin, in his time, when he spent time as a conscientious objector in the 1940s, he basically drew from his grandmother Julia's ideas, and she would send him texts. She would send him scriptural texts to try to keep him again grounded. So Rustin's calm and open, nonviolent demeanor was described in a note, and I'm going to read this to you, by John Nevin Sire, who was the co-chair of the Fellowship of Reconciliation, or FOR, that he sent to Rustin's grandmother, Julia, on her birthday in 1944. Sayer recognized Rustin's kindness, humility, spirituality as her grandson sat in a maximum security prison at Ashland, Kentucky, for refusing to serve in the U.S. military or accept alternative service as a conscientious objector. So this is the note that he wrote. Rustin has a combination of gifts in singing, voice, dramatic recital of experiences, and personality inspired by loving nonviolence. I believe that these gifts will take him very far if he can maintain his inner sweetness and humility of spirit, on the one hand, in the face of the bitter sufferings of the Negro race and himself at the hands of white prejudice, and on the other hand, against the adulation which will come his way because of his talents and personality. End quote. So Sayer here captures Rustin's precocious and charismatic personality, informing his nonviolent spirit. But Sayer believed Rustin faced a potential dilemma, and this is what he did. He thought Rustin had to find a way through his inner sweetness and humility of spirit to balance his dealing with the sufferings of the Negro race at the hands of white prejudice and the equally dangerous personal adulations that will come his way because of his talents. Julia, in the way that she always responded, this is just one example. responded to Sayer, as she often did to Rustin, by reference to the scriptures. So she would go straight to the scriptures. She shows her intimate knowledge of both the Old Testament with the poetic Psalms and the Pauline epistles with the book of Romans from the New Testament. And she writes back, quote, "It is very comforting and heartwarming to have so many kind expressions of Bayard's friends. In a letter to me, Bayard asked at 1 o'clock p.m. that I read 56 Palm, and he would be reading it at the same time. Again, he's sitting in prison. Also, in Romans 8:28, I'm sorry, God has promised that all things work together for good to those who love God. Mr. Sayer, while I am concerned and anxious about Bayard, I have no real fear as I live in the promises of God. And I love the 91st Psalm, and she quotes it, "He that abideth in the secret places of the Most High shall dwell under the shadow of the Almighty," end quote. So here, Rustin embraced his profound spiritual connections with his grandmother while he was physically away in prison. They shared the power of scripture and, quote, the promises of God, end quote, by engaging in what I call shared holy readings in time that seemed unique to them. By referencing Psalms 56, Julia showed how Rustin trusted in God to guide him through the worst of times. For example, several passages from Psalm 56 appropriately validated Julia's confidence in the promises of God vis-a-vis or in relation to Rustin's well-being. And it says this, "When I am afraid, I will trust in you, in God, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I will not be afraid. What can mortal man do to me?" And that's key. "Then my enemies will turn back when I call for help. By this I will know that God is for me. In God, whose word I praise. In the Lord, whose word I praise. In God I trust. I will not be afraid. What can man do to me? I will present my thank offerings to you. Thank you, sorry, for you have delivered my soul from death, my feet from stumbling, that I may walk before God in light of life." So here again is the grandmother, Julia, as an example, showing that she's drawing on the scriptures to basically confirm the will of God. Again, that Rustin also what was rooted in his ideas and his thoughts. So she was doing this via exchanges, letter exchanges, not only with him directly, but with friends of Rustin's. So this is part of what I also show is that through this process over several years, about 10 years or so, led Rustin to officially submitting his application for membership into the society. So he was not, again, a birthright Quaker. So I point out that this is something that, again, needs to be visible up front in terms of Rustin's biography, that it took him time, right, as he built his experiences into applying to the society officially. And this happened in 1943. So he received the membership officially. So by the time Rustin gained membership, he had been attending the 15th Street monthly meeting in Manhattan, in New York City. Since shortly arriving in New York City to study at the City College of New York in 1937. After a long time attending Quaker meeting and embodying what I'm calling again the pragmatic Quaker sensibilities, throughout his early life, Rustin decided to pursue membership and submitted his initial inquiry to the New York preparatory meeting responsible at the time for bringing business items such as membership requests and applications to the monthly meeting. So officially, the monthly meeting of New York announced, quote, the committee appointed to give attention to the request for membership of Bayard Rustin recommends that his request be granted. The recommendation is approved and he is received into membership. So he saw that as a validation, right? Something that was powerful moving forward. So this is something that, again, allowed him to make more demands of friends because he went through this process. He officially applied. He was received, right? The monthly meeting received him. So this is the statement that I mentioned. So Rustin was not a birthright, but a convinced friend. Even though there's still, as I lay out in the chapter, that there is no clear reasons, explicit reasons as to why he applied when he did. So again, that's still out there, but it doesn't change the fact that he held these values and he saw it as something very important for him to commit to even more, which I believe catapulted him into, again, pressing other friends to engaging the social injustices that they confronted. So of course, this is him. Some of the photos here that you may or may not have seen. The journey of reconciliation that became a model later for the civil rights movement. The freedom rides, for example. This became the model. Trying to desegregate in interstate. So here is another example of his post becoming an official committed friend when he gave the lecture, which was a lecture that many luminaries of the Quaker historians, Quaker theologians, and others before him were invited to give. So again, that was an honor that he was invited to give this, and I wanted to just point out parts of the lecture when he says, "Surely I must at all times, attempt to obey the law of the state," which is something again that he did as a conscientious objector, but rooted in his committed Quakerism and broader religious faith. But when the will of God and the will of the state conflict, I am compelled to follow the will of God. So you can see the other side of not the scriptural authority side, but the will of God as an experience of something that he himself has experienced, right, from the inside. So people call it intuition at times. Then he continues, if it is true that violence destroys our liberty, it is also possible to offer some evidence that violence causes inconsistencies that are tantamount to moral suicide. The moral man is he who is opposed to injustice per se, opposed to injustice wherever he finds it. The moral man looks for injustice first of all in himself. We observe the eternal truth proclaimed by Lao Tzu, Buddha, Jesus, St. Francis, George Fox, and Gandhi. So you can see the ecumenical, right? The very diverse sources of his faith. The use of violence will destroy moral integrity, the very fundamental of community on which peace rests. We cannot remain honest unless we are opposed to injustice wherever it occurs, first of all, in ourselves. So you can see I put this up here for a reason. I also put some of the words in bold so you can see the various elements that I try to bring out in that depiction, my horrible handwriting perhaps, the Venn diagram depiction, trying to bring the various elements of his faith together. So here you see some of the testimonies, right? The integrity, peace, community embedded within it. He brings in George Fox, right? Trying to talk about the traditions going back to the 17th century, his recent knowledge of the Gandhi philosophy. So he's drawing on all of these to try to, again, push um, the young friends at the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting at the time, right, to taking violence, war seriously, right, not taking this for granted. And here, let's see where I wanted to add a few things before I move on. So in the way that, again, he talks about this particular section, it's also similar to what he writes in opposing conscription. I'm not sure if did I put it in here. Oh, let me go back to that for a second. So he writes in his note, let's see what date is this, in late 1940s, so same period in the mid 1940s. In particular, 1943. So this echoes what he said in 1943, in other words. If you recall, he became an official committed, right, Quaker in 1943, in March of 1943. He writes this note immediately in November of 1943 to the so-called Federal Local Board, right, about why he is against war and the draft. And you'll see how he brings this out, again, these various elements of his religious faith. So he writes, "For 8 years, I have believed war to be impractical, in a denial of our Hebrew Christian tradition. The social teachings of Jesus are, number one, respect for personality. Number two, service, to service what he calls the summum bonum, or in other words, a Latin word for the highest good. Number three, overcoming evil with good. Number four, the brotherhood of man." So these principles are violated by participation in war. Believing this and having before me Jesus's continued resistance to that which he considers evil, I was compelled to resist war by registering as a conscientious objector. However, a year later, he says, I became convinced that conscription as well as war equally is inconsistent with the teachings of Jesus. I must resist conscription also. I wish to inform you that I cannot voluntarily submit to an order springing from the Selective Service and Training Act of War for war. So he's pushing back on the actual act, the law itself. And later on, he tells us in a very definitive way, again, I'm trying to bring out how he's drawing on his faith directly. He says, war is wrong. Conscription is a concomitant of modern war. You're basically complicit if you, again, conscribe. You do not fight back. He says, conscription for so vast an evil as war is wrong. Conscription for war is inconsistent with freedom of conscience, which is not merely the right to believe, but to act on the degree of truth that one receives to follow a vocation which is God-inspired and God-directed. So he says that he says, that God motivates me to use my whole being to combat by non-violent means the ever-growing racial tension in the United States, at the same time, the state's directions, right, for conscription. I must at all times attempt to obey the law of the state, but when the will of God, there it comes again, the will of God and the will of the state conflict, I am compelled to follow the will of God. If I cannot continue my present vocation, I must resist. So you can see there, like basically the will of God is at the center of this. So he goes back and forth with the will of God the way he interprets Jesus, and also he draws on the scriptures that he engages with and exchanges with his grandmother in various ways. So the last part, are we doing okay with time?
We're getting close.
Okay,
Can you 5 minutes?
sure.
Awesome. Thanks, Carlos.
So that's what, again, I'm just trying to show some examples here. And the other one, of course, is he in around 1986, he explicitly tells us where his source of activism comes from. So I'm not sure if anyone has seen this quote, but this is a quote that I use in chapter 39 as the beginnings. So I traced his statement backwards in that chapter. So I try to root it in, again, in his history. So here he says, my activism did not spring from my being gay, or for that matter, from my being Black. Rather, it is rooted fundamentally in my Quaker upbringing and the values that were instilled in me by my grandparents who reared me. Those values are based on the concept of a single human family and the belief that all members of that family are equal. The racial injustice that was present in this country during my youth was a challenge to my belief in the oneness of the human family, in which I mentioned in the way he talked about it in his 1976 book. It demanded my involvement in the struggle to achieve interracial democracy, but it is very likely that I would have been involved had I been a white person with the same philosophy. Needless to say, I worked side by side with many white people who held these same values, some of whom gave as much, if not more, to the struggle than myself. So here he's pointing at his oneness of the human family notion that, again, ought to be the focus of change, of trying to get people to align themselves, right, based on a common goal, as opposed to, again, he's drawing on, it wasn't his identity per se, or his sexuality, but more about his Quaker upbringing and how that allowed him to think about the oneness of the human family notion. So he shows you some pictures of him, again, engaging in that oneness of the human family in various ways. Martin Luther King in the 1950s. If you saw that earlier quote when he says that you have to deal with the injustices in yourself first before engaging the world. This is something that he passed on, right? Martin Luther King Jr., you saw it in his writing. And I and others have made the argument that that language is taken from his exchanges with Rustin. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was an idea that Rustin had, and others proposed it, and Martin Luther King Jr. took it, right, as an institution that he could run. His political, again, protest to politics statement in 65 also gives you a little bit of that. We need to protest the bottom part, the notion that our integration into American life, we cannot claim to have answers to all the complex problems of modern society, but we can't agitate the right questions by probing at the contradictions which still stand in the way of the Great Society. So he's critiquing the Great Society program that doesn't go far enough that Lyndon Johnson proposed. Right? His proposal is something more closer to economic rights. So this is when he started moving away from the civil rights to economic rights. And you see the Freedom Budget for All Americans that focused on that, to win full and final triumph of the civil rights movement, to be achieved by going beyond civil rights, linking the goal of racial justice with the goal of economic justice for all people in the United States, and doing so by rallying massive segments of the 99% of the American people in a powerfully democratic and moral crusade. to guarantee a job for everyone ready and willing to work, a guaranteed income for those unable to work or those who should not be working, a living wage to lift the working poor out of poverty. So again, this is part of what he did, and I think they move forward because I want to continue that. Um, and here's another aspect of his oneness of the human family when he critiques, of course, the Black Power movement, because again, he had a different perspective. He said that, as you can say here, he says, I am for Negroes forming alliances with liberal and religious organizations and with trade unions. I think that Black Power is a politically reactionary and divisive slogan, while Carmichael thinks that it is a psychologically progressive and will unify the Negro community. He thinks that the violence and disturbances in Watts and Harlem are signs of new militancy. I believe they are the tragic outgrowth of societal negligence. I advocated the economic program of the Freedom Budget for All Americans, and Mr. Carmichael in turn asked that his name be removed from the list of those endorsing the budget. I advocated nonviolence, democratic social change, and integration. Mr. Carmichael did not comment on nonviolence. He offers no program for democratic social change, and he believes integration is irrelevant. So again, you can see the battles. He's still sitting on his oneness of the human family, and he's trying to approach the economic rights argument in those terms, as opposed to, again, separating in terms of racial groups. So again, that's part of what he was up to. Let me move on. That's him at age 74 in 1886. To wrap up, here's a little bit of a summary. So hope and aspirations for real political democratic life. The oneness of the human family notion guided his interventions and engagements with the social and political world. He was known, again, throughout an almost 50-year activist life as a calm but passionate and ego-less being, although not perfect. No one is. He thought that everyone, regardless of socioeconomic status, class positioning, citizenship, civic standing, secular or sacred religious beliefs, political affiliations, sexuality, and any other descriptive social markers or identities, ought to begin any political social activism or debates from an ego-less state, open to revelations and other unfamiliar experiences that will lead to community and thus potential collaboration and shared transformation. Again, he had many shapes and forms, many ideas that collided over the 50-year period. Yeah, that's basically it. Maybe some lessons that we can learn. We can talk about perhaps the importance of resisting the evils of injustice, political, social, and economic, and violence of all forms around the world. Holistically opening ourselves in good faith to others who at times may seem drastically different with opposite thoughts and ideas in pursuit of common ground. Engaging in the complexities of the social and political world from a humanistic, moral, calm nature. And that's a quick wrap up. So I apologize for being so fast there at the end. And let me see if I can figure this out with the.
Thank you, Carlos. That was great. Why don't we, I'd love to open it up for questions from those of you who are here, questions or discussion, things you would like Carlos to say a little bit more about, or things you've been thinking about in relationship to Rustin's life. So maybe if you could raise your hand, your Zoom hand, and then I will call on you that way. All right, Allison, go ahead.
Carlos, thank you. That was great. I really enjoyed it. Is there any evidence that the interaction of Bayard and Malcolm X influenced Malcolm X in any way? Because his position became much more conciliatory later on, didn't it?
Yes, yes. I don't cover that in either of these two chapters, but there is some evidence not only of his engagement with. They had a debate. They had one debate, if you remember, Howard University debate. That was the infamous debate, and you can see elements of it, I believe, online. And that moment, there was. I wouldn't say there was enough evidence at that moment, but as time went on and Malcolm X also started, he departed from the Nation of Islam, separated from the philosophy of Elijah Muhammad, and so you see him doing making the trip to Mecca and coming back and seeing that both Rustin, the nonviolent, the integrationist strategy has merit. So Martin Luther King Jr., again, they didn't have exchanges in the way that we would have hoped, right, back then. But there is some evidence there in some basic writings, which I don't have here. That's also part of what I'm hoping to continue with this research and bringing out Rustin's, again, pragmatic Quakerism, what I'm calling pragmatic Quakerism, and bringing these kinds of exchanges into a book form, hopefully. But thank you for the question. Yes, there's some, but I don't have anything here that I can give you definitive.
Great question. How about others? What are you thinking about? Questions you have or things that are coming up for you after hearing Carlos's presentation?
Hopefully it was a different approach that you are used to in thinking about Bayard Rustin.
I really liked hearing the oneness of the human family as kind of an organizing principle, and maybe kind of a through line for Rustin's life. And I think you talked a little bit about the gradualist integrationist approach. I was sort of interested in that. Could you maybe say a little bit more about that in terms of what that looked like in his life over the course of the work he was doing? How was he being gradualist in that way?
Right. So the part of what he learned over time, drawing on the Gandhian, those pillars, is that you need to meet people where they are, right? And learn what the problems are. Because again, it's easy to just jump in and assume that people are struggling because of certain things. So his approach was, we need to be gradual. He was drawing, again, I didn't do it in these two particular chapters, but he's also drawing on the Quaker tradition, the movement of the gradualist kind of philosophy of integrating those who are outside of the system into the system, right? A form of assimilation, if you will. But here, the way he looked at it was, let's gain certain rights within the system, as opposed to, of course, let's dismantle a system. He moved a little bit back and forth. In his early days, he was more progressive, right? The Communist Party, the Social Democrats, and slowly moved a little to the liberal side. But that integration idea is rooted in, I believe, again, in the Gandhian, let's reform the system, let's make space for those who have been excluded by providing, right, applying the rights that others have been provided. And then he starts moving into the economic side a little more, because again, it was there during the late 30s, early 40s. The integrationists included the part of the labor movement, right, with Philip Randolph, A. Philip Randolph. These ideas that we need to try to bring people into the economic system a little more, provide avenues for that. But he was critiqued because the gradualist approach wasn't fast enough, right? It wasn't something that he advocated patience, he advocated learning, these kinds of things. Even today, people would say, "Oh, it might not work because of it requires engaging with people who may not want you to exist, or may not even acknowledge you as a human being, or and he had to also grapple with that. How does that what does that mean? What does that mean to so he went back to those principles. One is the human family. He even said he struggled growing up in Westchester at times, but he kept going back to that. The grandmother, right? Quoting the scriptures, going back to the will of God as the guiding light in confronting these tough questions. So to answer part of your question, what it looked like the 63, right, March on Washington that he helped organize. That's the oneness of the human family, trying to bring people from across the United States, across the board, based on the common interest of jobs first. People forget the jobs. It was economic rights first and so-called freedom. So economic rights, right, and voting rights, human rights, all of that as part of his integrationist but oneness of the human family notion. Then later on, as I try to lay out in 1967, 1968, and then Walter Nagel, who was also a colleague, and he was his last partner. I've had exchanges with him over the years, and he was able to bring him into at the time, what was called the gay rights movement, right, in the 70s and 80s, towards the end of his life. So he was also involved in that in the integrationist manner.
Great, thank you. Carlos, there's a question in the chat that you touched on a little bit just now, but I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about that.
And is this David, I believe?
Yes.
I'm very taken with the phrase pragmatic Quakerism and wonder if you have any thoughts on how this can be landed with today. And currently faces, or how might Oh, yeah, great question. Well, this is part of a bigger project as well, a different project that this comes out of. As I said, I came to Rustin via two different things. One is my other Quaker political history project, and of course the Afro-American studies side. But the pragmatic Quakerism is drawing on these notions of American pragmatism, where you think about engaging the truth, right, directly, looking at a systematic way of breaking down problems, trying to reach community, trying to make sense of what communities are engaging with. So I try to bring that in as right, there's the idea of truth in the pragmatic way, and of course the various testimonies, values, methods under the big umbrella of Quakerism that we can, from different sides. And in terms of that, I think that's one way. I believe your question is how might pragmatic Quakerism be shaped and how might it shape us? So I think if you focus on what people, which is what Rustin did and others, have in common, not necessarily excluding differences, what you have in common, you can then bring in the differences, and communities can flourish more if you focus on the commonalities, the needs of a community, right, across the board. And I think this notion can do that. Focus on the truth, defining the truth based on the experiences of people in a particular community. And of course, the Quakerism side is being open to changes, being open to different views. Again, in a practical way. And it's very difficult, as you can imagine, right? Humans, we are human after all. We have competing interests that get in the way of these of engaging based on something commonality. For example, right, jobs. Rustin would say jobs. Everyone wants a job, a good paying job. Everyone wants adequate housing, affordable housing. Everyone wants education. Everyone wants to get paid what they're worth, or these kinds of things that can bring people together. And this is why Rustin also um, focused on the role of unions as a powerful institution, despite, again, the critiques about unions not going far enough, but he still pointed at the unions as the space to bring to life the freedom budget. Says the freedom budget is nice on paper, but how do you make that come to life? And that's when I argue that the pragmatic Quaker approach makes that happen, makes people come together, because you're bringing it down to the ground of what do people actually want. That's a long answer, I think, to a short question.
Any other questions or comments for Carlos?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, yeah.
Well, I just wanted to know what others, how have others encountered Bayard Rustin, I guess. And the second part of the question, of course, is whether what I presented change your views or not. It's the professor in me coming out. I'm sorry.
I think I already said that on the introductions that I came across him through Woodbrook course through the Black Lives things that came up, and I also find it interesting that Friend's House in London didn't have his book in their bookshop, and I just thought it was very interesting. Just that alone, I thought, well, if he's so, how integral he's been and whatever and all the rest, but he's actually not even in Friends Meeting House bookshop. What's that about? So that I did, it just raised questions just from that alone.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably one of the reasons why we were so excited about this project as well, and the Quaker World, the book, and hopefully that the book will be there.
I hadn't heard of Bayard Rustin before. I became acquainted with the Quakers, but I felt a huge sense of relief in a way, because Quakerism in the UK is still so terribly culturally, socially homogenous. It's predominantly white and middle class, and I'm neither of those things. And I'm quite desperate to find role models, to find people that at least are not white middle class people. And I've really enjoyed this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. I came across Rustin. I didn't, even though I had been a Quaker for quite some time, I hadn't come across Rustin until a friend of mine who is trans and um, an anti-poverty organizer, part of unions and various things, introduced me to Rustin as um, as his favorite Quaker, and so coming more out of I think the connection both being queer and being somebody who's interested in union work and his economic bill of rights and those kinds of things was maybe where my friend's interests connected, and um, so I think that was really good. And I think I already mentioned that I really appreciated being reminded of the oneness idea within Rustin, and trying to make sense of the ways in which Rustin's views changed over time, or maybe I don't know if they changed, but I guess your question was kind of like, how did he remain consistent? And so I've been sort of interested in the through lines, because as you mentioned, he was involved with socialists early on, and then it seems like in some ways he becomes more conservative than that later, and his politics continue to change and shift as he got older later in life, and I think you gave some ways to at least try to help make sense of what probably felt like Rustin as a through line, where at least to me it looks inconsistent sometimes.
Right. This is
So
part of I've had discussions with others, and they always they say, so what about his stance on Zionism, right? Which is the
right,
one that comes out all the time, the early 70s, and I'm still trying to, again, I'm as part of the research, but one of the things that I've come across is that a couple of things. One is his will of God notion that he kept going back to seems to be part of the through line. Um, and the other part of it is, which is always interesting, because of the way that Zionism, the development of Zionism in the right from the early 20th century all the way to the 1970s, right? The party split, right? The current party and the Labor Party in Israel. So he was associated with the labor side at one time, and then now there's, since 1977, the coalitions, right? There's coalition parties, because that one party can't dominate but in 77 he was around that. But the way again, I'm reading it through the will of God notion that he kept coming back to, and his anti-nationalistic perspectives, that he saw the religious side more than the nationalist side. Let me put it that way. And that's why, again, this is one reading right now that I'm trying to make sense of. So if you separate the religious from the national, you have one thing. But then if you bring in the religious and the nationalist notions of Zionism, maybe you can critique him in that sense, saying that, okay, this is something that he was against the Black Power movement, right? The nationalistic, Black nationalist kinds of approaches and ideology, but he seems to be supporting the Zionist. But again, if you put it in context, and it's something that I'm trying to do, is put it in the late 60s, 1970s Zionism, as opposed to the Zionism that develops in the 1980s.
right,
It's different. So people critique him because they're probably looking at it from the 1980s plus, right? He was already in his age, older, passes away. It takes a different form. So it gets tricky. We have to try to bring him into what was happening in the various, it was a little more progressive in the 60s and 70s. Again, it's not just one monolithic Zionist group. It was complicated.
Yeah. That's
But that's
good.
part of what I'm trying to work out, and hopefully you can bring something out.
I look forward to seeing the results of that. I'm glad you're working on it. I am.
Has others picked up the what? Have looked at any of the world, Quaker world? What's I don't get the phrase there. What's the phrase, Kristen?
Yeah.
I'm trying to.
Is that a Britishism? I'm unfamiliar with that as well.
I'm not familiar with the.
The-
Off-piste, it just means that he kind of went astray, right?
Oh,
Interesting. Learn something new every day. See.
Apparently, neither Wes nor Carlos go skiing.
But that's. Oh, okay. I see. I don't ski. I'm in central New York State with all the snow and ski country, but I don't ski. I can barely walk. No, I'm just kidding.
It's just an British thing. I don't ski, but it's a really common phrase to say you've just gone off piste. A lot of us don't ski. It's just
okay.
I like that.
I guess off the rails for us here. But
Yes.
if you take
That's the idea.
Rustin in the way that I'm in the approach that I'm taking to his life and work, I think we would make more sense of the complexity that was him engaging with Zionism in the early 1970s, as opposed to, again, I'm not naming names. There are scholars and others who look at these historical figures from the present and things that developed after them, which it would be unfair. Right? The same thing as, when people ask, what would Rustin do today? Well, he's not alive. He wouldn't be doing anything because he's not alive at this point. You can say maybe some of his models or principles, can they apply today? How do they look? Would they look like without him? Right? Just his principles and his. So I would look at it from that perspective, which is the question that was posed by David. Right? If I would have given a name, which I did, right? Pragmatic Quaker faith, or just looking at the oneness of a human family that comes out of his own mouth in his own writing. How does that apply today? That would make sense. But if we try to uproot, like I said in the beginning, dead thinkers and bring them to life, it would be a meaningless venture. Or us going into a time machine.
Hey, that might be fun.
Which is something we can't do. Or others have said, I'm going to my other use a Ouija board maybe and bring the person back. That doesn't make any sense either. So we only have their words and deeds.
Yeah. Well, good. Any final comments or questions for Carlos before we head out? Esther.
It was just to ask you, really, what excites you most about Rustin? What sort of really draws you to him as the one thing?
I just like the integration. It's not name the word, the ecumenical notion, because I basically grew up again poor, working class, New York City, and I don't want to tell you what period because then I will reveal my real age.
21.
Let me tell you, I grew up in the 20th century. That's enough to tell you that. So I reading him and looking at the kinds of work that he engaged in resonated with me. Again, working class, mixed neighborhoods, getting people's taking ideas from different people and making it your own and engaging the tough questions. So that gravitated to me for some reason. And the more I go into it, I see how complex of a human being he was, but that's good. I mean, this is as opposed to, again, let's freeze these people in time and pretend they were just this. And every time I go into them, it just fascinates me. The more I learn, basically. So I just thank you for the question, because it excites me enough to produce a 70, 80 page chapter that had to be reduced to 2. And I have all these
There's too
elements still
many.
floating around for more chapters, which will hopefully become a book.
Exactly. Exactly. You have all the material right there.
So, well, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for coming
Well,
out and your busy time, your busy days. And,
yes. Thank you all for coming. Carlos, thank you so much for sharing with us your work and research. Thank you all for participating on a Friday afternoon or evening, depending on where you are in the world. And yeah, really, really nice to see you. If you got the little form, if you want to drop an evaluation in, Stuart really wanted me to make sure that you had a chance to fill this out. And yeah, I think that's everything. So why don't we have just a moment of worship together? Is there another comment?
oh, no, I was going to say just
Yeah.
a quick little promotion that
Yes.
I am working on a short course for the spring through Woodbrook with
Ah,
Stuart
fantastic.
on Rustin. So basically, so I'll have more space and time to talk about various parts of Rustin's work. So look out for
That's
that. I think
awesome.
it's April of next year, I believe. So
Great.
cheap
So now
promotion there, not really, just trying to
you
promote
all
the.
have had a teaser. Well, that sounds exciting, Carlos. All right, why don't we have a moment of silence together? So good to be with all of you today. Blessings, and hope to see you around soon.
Thank you.